English translation 675th Contact Wednesday the 8th of March 2017, 14:45 hours.
Ah, you are already here, dear friend. Salute again and welcome. Was today again a short correction work, therefore we have probably also enough time for our discussion.
I greet you again, my friend. Yes, the correction work was done quickly, and my time is not limited either.
Then, right at the beginning of our conversation, I would have a question about which we have never spoken openly before.
What's this about?
Because Bernadette continues to write for my biography. But I have to go back a bit and disclose a few things, for the time being. And in this regard, we also talked about the fact that your father Svath not only brought me during and after World War II to various war-torn states in Europe and the Pacific, and that he made me see tremendous atrocities and war crimes at the moment. I often had a hard time chewing on it, as you know, but with the help of your father I was able to process everything, so that I did not suffer any mental, emotional, psychic, conscious disadvantages or even damages, but could strengthen and educate myself against it and also become the person I had to be, who I am today, in order to fulfill my mission. Svath also took me around the world to other countries and let me see many things that I would never have been able to see and experience later during my own travels, which took me personally to many countries. In this regard, he also explained me a lot about the geology, the atmosphere, Earth's climate and the weather conditions, etc., whereby everything impressed me strongly. For example, also that the rainforest in South America could exist only by the sandstorms of the Sahara. With about 9 million square kilometers, the Sahara is the largest dry desert in the world, but it is not only made up of sand. Most of it is the Sahara, and I know this from my own experience and observation when I crossed it, as well as other deserts I know, namely a stone and rock desert, where I even want to speak of a gravel or boulder desert, while the worldwide known sand desert makes up only about a fifth or at most a quarter of the total desert area. Also in Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Persia, and Saudi Arabia, I have noticed this equally, that more stone, rock, gravel, and boulders characterize the desert pictures than sand. But now back to the South American tropical rainforests, in relation to which your father taught me that the enormous masses of rain that fall there, the nutrients necessary for the trees and other plants, wash out of the thin layer of soil or humus, without which everything would atrophy and die if this were not counteracted naturally. And this counteracting effect, as Svath explained when he flew with me to South America towards the end of the 1940s, is due precisely to the fact that through the Sahara in North Africa, and as a result of the fact that conditions prevail in this desert, through which enormous sandstorms occur again and again, whirling up hundreds of millions of tons of sand dust, between 30 to 40 million tons of sand are transported into the rainforests of South America by the storm winds, thus enriching the rainforest soils again with macro and micronutrients. This natural mode of transport, that is to say this natural transport mechanism, is called Aeolian transport, in relation to the Greek mythology after the wind god Aiolos. But Svath also explained something about the normal forests in Europe and the primeval forests in Asia and Africa, namely that their nutrients in the soil can only be regenerated by external natural help, in Europe by normal rainfalls and snow, in Asia and Africa by large rainfalls, such as the monsoon. The rainwater and the snow are saturated with nutrients of various kinds by aerosols swirled up from the vastness of Earth, so that sufficient nutrients always rain down for all trees, bushes, and plants of every kind.
This is all correct, because on the one hand, macronutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium, as well as micronutrients and trace elements such as boron, cobalt, or molybdenum, are brought into the rainforests in dust-induced form by the natural transport mechanism, whereby not only in the rainforests there is usually a lack of, but also of other nutrients. In addition, most tropical soils lack various important nutrients for food plants. Basically, plants of all kinds, trees, shrubs, and all plants need carbon dioxide and oxygen to grow, which they must obtain from the air, water, and about 13 vital nutrients from the soil. As far as tropical rainforests are concerned, they grow on different soils, with the poorest soils being those of the Amazon basin. Today, this is the largest remaining rainforest block in the world, stretching over 9 South American countries. Rainforest soils have a typical yellow to red coloration, as you know, but all plants of every genus and species need their vital nutrients, and these are supplied by Sahara dust and rain, etc. So it is the case with everything that nature regulates the whole thing by distributing the necessary nutrients and thriving through dust, even otherwise than only through the Sahara and normal rain. And that all around in relation to the normal primeval forests, gardens, forests, water plants, and aquatic organisms, as well as meadows and fields. So far, but you wanted to talk about something else at the beginning of the conversation, dear friend, but we have deviated from it.
Actually, I did not deviate from what I want to talk about, but it only took a preview, which created a certain connection to the rest. So now we go on. The talk was also about the fact that Svath took me to many places in many countries of the world and to foreign people and let me see their customs and habits as well as things and happenings, etc., which would have remained closed to me as a traveler, tourist or globetrotter, including the contacts with rulers arranged by Svath. Everything was extremely instructive for me, and also taught me that all people on Earth were and are human beings. No matter to which peoples, social classes, religions, sects, or other ideologies they belonged and which works and activities they carried out. Even though I found some things to be dreadful, unjust, and despicable, such as torture, cannibalism, executions, headhunting, and very horrible war atrocities. I learned a great deal from them all, and thus shaped my personal behavior with regard to the harmless possible conduct and correct treatment of my fellow human beings, regardless of who or how they were. This does not mean, however, that I cannot be dismissive or vocal when necessary in the right setting, nor that I cannot simply keep silent when unavoidable and not say what is necessary, or that I would not demand my rights. Through everything that Svath taught me and what he made me see around the world in many places, I also learned the way of life and the way of acting that is my own to this day and will remain so until the end of my life. That's one thing, but there's another very important factor, and that's the one that refers to Asket, which we've never talked about openly before, namely that after her official time of contact with me, when she was finished, she kept up the contact for the next 11 years unofficially and in an absolutely private way, until the 4th of January 1975, after which the official contacts with your daughter Sim Yase began on Tuesday, the 28th of January 1975. After which you and Quetzal and many others to this day joined in. During the 11 years of official contact with Asket until the official end of contact, Asket was also very often on the road with me. Often at night when she picked me up in Uiticon, where I was forced to spend 3 years, but where for certain reasons it was possible for me to often be on the road with Asket. This always happens when I said goodbye to Uiticon 3 to 4 times a year for 2 to 3 weeks each, and went on wanderings without permission. Asket was always at the right time at the right place and in the whole world with me on the way, because she had taken me after the official contact time privately under her wing, and was therefore always helpful to me. When I left Uiticon in 1962 and went to Bern to the Wankdorffeldstrasse to learn sandblasting, this was only the beginning of the fact that Asket brought me as a free man to many places in Africa and in the Arabian North Africa, where I also experienced some adventures, such as in the Balkans, in Greece, in the Near, Middle and Rear Orient, as well as in various countries in the Near East to Burma and Asia, but also in the Far East. In the 1950s and 1960s, I was able to visit and travel to various countries with Asket in short times, to experience all sorts of adventures, even as a criminal hunter. But this became more difficult and what I could only secretly do together with Asket on an hourly or daily basis. This was precisely the reason, after I had lost the serious bus accident and my left arm in Iskenderun, because I had kidnapped and married my bride in Greece in the mid-1960s, whereby marriage was my mission and my intention, only to return finally to Switzerland in 1969, to begin my mission and to found the association Feigu. So it happened first, that after my marriage in Corinthos, I returned to Switzerland with my spouse, where I earned enough money during the next half year with my own small trading business to be able to set off again, of course with my wife, to Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Turkey, Persia, Pakistan, and India. And this always happened in secret contact with Asket, which I had to hide from my wife, because she was boundlessly jealous, which also happened later, when your daughter Simya Se became my new player and contact person on the 28th of January, 1975, and ordered her according to higher order, that for certain reasons with regard to earthly UFO contact fraudsters appearing with certainty, etc., her origin was named as by the Pleiades. That actually happened, that in Germany, the USA and Canada, etc., various fraudsters appeared and claimed that they had contact with Pleiades, and especially with Simyase and Yu Ptah. When all the fraudulent claims, lies, and calumnies of these Earth humans became too much for you, Pleiaren, the cat was then let out of the bag and declared and officially announced that you do not come from the Seven Stars or from the Pleiades in our Dern universe, but from much further away, namely from far beyond the Pleiades, and from another space-time structure in which you call your home system Pleiaren. Well, in 1967 our daughter Gilgamesha was born in the hospital in Quetta, Pakistan, on our way back from India. After 2 months we traveled via Persia and Turkey to Greece. Until spring 1969 we lived in Thessaloniki, where I produced and sold various souvenirs on my own account in order to earn enough money. Then it was time to return to Switzerland for good. At the civil engineering and road construction company Alfredo Piatti in Dietlikon, where I had previously worked as a machinist, I worked again as a machinist, which was possible with only one arm, but still difficult. There I met Jacobus, who had to deliver truckloads of concrete gravel several times a day to the large concrete production plant. At that time I lived briefly with my family in Ruggenthal and then in Barretswil, after which I bought a house on Oberdorfstrasse in Hinwil and extended it together with Jacobus. When I gave up my job at the Piatti company, where I had to do the work of 2 men, but was paid too little, I committed myself as a night watchman and night porter at the Maschinenfabrik Ruti. Then I sold our house to the community of Hinwil because it became too small due to unforeseen offspring. The community also made an old farmhouse available to me and my family in Hinwil at Wiehaldenstrasse 10. When we moved there, I soon changed my job to Vaci AG in Zurich and later to the company Zellweger in Uster, where I worked as night porter and night watchman, but where I was also responsible for the fire alarm control for the Wagerenhof, a foundation for people with a mental resp, conscious and multiple impairment. I stayed there until spring 1976, when I started my own business again by working as a life counselor at home, at Wiehaldenstrasse 10 in Hinwil, and also helping mentally ill people get back on their feet and into life. There, just at Wiehaldenstrasse 10, the house was later torn down and turned into an old people's settlement or something like that. I bred, as already at Oberdorfstrasse, in a self-built large-area aviary divided into various large cages, various curvilinear bird species and parakeets, which I sold to pet shops throughout Switzerland. When the Hinterschmidruti became our home, I sold the aviary to a policeman in Muncheltorf, where I also started the first official steps to fulfill my mission at Wiehaldenstrasse 10 and announced the association FIGU, where Bernadette appeared for the first time, and still works very intensively as an actuary in the FIGU. That's actually what we officially talked about very little or never at all. Which had to be, I think, because these facts should also be mentioned in the biography Bernadette is working on.
What you say is true because we have never officially talked about the private contacts between you and Asket, nor about various other things you have mentioned. But to mention this now is really important for your biography, so Bernadette will have to work in the important facts.
Bernadette and I have decided, if possible, to spend about 2 hours each Monday afternoon together to bring together the necessary facts, which she will then work out and write down. And when I think about it right now, my 3 crows come to mind, which I had as a boy, but which is already contained in a part of the biography. But I think that the fact has not yet been mentioned that the crow, who could speak something and with whom I had a very special friendship relationship, brought me special little gifts again and again, whereby in the end there were hundreds. Of various stones of all kinds and colors, she once brought me a glittering and used cocoa packet, various brooches, shards of glass and jewelry chains, but as often also coins of all values, such as 5, 10, 20, and 50 centimes, but also 1, 2, and 5 francs, which she had organized somewhere, but I never knew where she fetched them in the wide surroundings, where she was often on her way. Only once could I find out where she got various coins from, namely from the upper flat in grandmother's chalet, where the kitchen window was open at Mrs. Wiedeker's return. Of course I gave her the money back and explained everything, after which she left no more coins on the table or anywhere else. But where my crow had brought everything else over the years I could never find out, because their flight area stretched quite far.
I know that birds of crows do this when they get used to people and make friends with them, so to speak. But before I forget, I have to tell you from Zafanat Paneak and Yanarara that your assumption regarding the strange and partly harmful incidents in the center and the disturbing and partly malignant changes in the scriptural works you write in the computer are based on religious liberal energies. These energies, they both explain, have a self-acting power and are very effectively directed towards hindering, distorting, and rendering impossible your work, because all your work is directed against the falsehood of the unreality and falsehood of all religious and sectarian matters, and against this religious sectarian energy and its forces, which are able to penetrate our created protective shields. There is at present no possibility of defense, because they correspond to a nature which was unknown to us so far, and which we have to fathom first. This means that the whole process of its exact analysis and a correspondingly effective defense can take years despite great, extensive and professional efforts and research, which Zafanat Paneach and Yanarara will explain to you themselves in the near future. Unfortunately, nothing can be done from our side against all the annoying, unpleasant, and sometimes even damaging incidents that occur in the center and have been appearing to other center residents for quite some time.
Then the case is clear, so we do not have to say anything more about it. Then I'd rather ask you a question about the immune patients, or those people on Earth who you call immune patients, as your father Svath called them. These people who are infected with germs, but who do not themselves suffer from the disease whose germs they carry, infect an unusually large number of other people. These immune patients are called super spreaders, or super disseminators by the Earth physicians, and occur in almost all infectious diseases. And they can also have a strong influence on the course of epidemics and pandemics. This is why they have now come into the focus of epidemiologists. Can you say something about that, please?
Immune patients, or super spreaders, or super disseminators, are people in social networks and maintain particularly many contacts to fellow human beings. In this way, they contribute particularly strongly to the spread of infectious diseases, especially epidemics. As a rule, they unconsciously pass diseases on to other patients, but this often happens carelessly, irresponsibly, or even deliberately maliciously. However, immunosuppressants or super spreaders are a factor by which epidemics can be prevented. If they take their responsibility and stay away from their fellow human beings instead of approaching them and infecting them. However, they do not usually do so, which quickly increases the rate of infection, makes an epidemic unavoidable, and can spread it. If, however, already at the beginning of a disease or epidemic, care is taken that immune patients or super spreaders have only little or no contact to the environment and thus to their fellow human beings, then the probability is much lower or even completely banished, or that no outbreak of an epidemic occurs. The immune patients, as we call this type of disease carriers, who are themselves immune to the disease whose pathogens they carry, infect extraordinarily many fellow human beings, especially with regard to all infectious diseases. If an epidemic occurs, then the course of the epidemic is very much dependent on the immune patients or the super spreaders and their constitution. This is because the normal influence of infection is changed, which leads to an excessive number of infections. An immune patient acts like a wandering infection catapult and spreads an epidemic much faster than, for example, a number of 20 or more people infected with a communicable disease who remain outside the reach of their fellow humans. Especially at the beginning of an epidemic, it is of great importance when an immune patient is among those infected that he behaves responsibly and isolates himself from his healthy fellow human beings. But if he fails to do so, he becomes significantly responsible for the further development of the outbreak and the spread of an epidemic. It is also a fact that a person's contagious potential depends on the very personal characteristics of his immune system, which determines how strongly it contributes to the spread of infectious diseases. If immune patients could be identified at the beginning of an outbreak of an epidemic, then their isolation would be possible, which, however, is not possible with the methods of current earthly medicine. Then the contact persons of the immune patients could not be protected by a corresponding vaccination or by corresponding disease-protecting drugs. As a result of this fact, even epidemics cannot be nipped in the bud by Earth's population. Isolation, voluntary or legally enforced, would, however, be the right and effective targeted measure. Because even medication and vaccination of large sections of the population are generally unable to fully guarantee the spread of a disease in the form of an epidemic. On Earth, where medicine is still quite deficient in every respect despite great progress, unfortunately infectious persons cannot always be detected, even during an outbreak of an epidemic. In order to be able to determine immune patients, very extensive investigations and clarifications are necessary, as well as a precise determination of the transmission pathways of the disease, whereby it is also necessary to carry out the necessary measures to prevent the spread of the disease or even the occurrence of an epidemic. But in this respect, as I said before, earthly medicine is still very disadvantageously underdeveloped and rudimentary. The factors to be mentioned in relation to immune patients vary from disease to disease, as they also have different causes, whereby a weakened immune system can be just as important as a genetic predisposition, but also a mutation, physical mobility, a disease, or a behavioral ingredient, that is to say, a behavioral component. The profession and living conditions of the infected person are also important, as is the number of pathogens excreted by the immune patient. The weakened immune system, as well as an additional disease, also more or less harmless, such as bronchitis. Colds, coughs, or colds are also able to increase and intensify the condition of the immune patients and thus the infectivity, because one disease helps the other to break out. However, it is not uncommon for external unpredictable factors to help the viruses spread and trigger a disease and epidemic. However, the effective fact is that it would be a very considerable advantage if immune patients and therefore highly infectious people could be identified in the terrestrial population before they can transmit infections. But unfortunately, terrestrial medicine is not yet in a position to do so due to its still deep deficiency. So a great deal remains to be done in terms of research on Earth humanity and medical research, in particular with regard to the factors of multi-layered infectivity.
Thank you for your execution. When I think about it, I also find that more and more allergies and diseases are arising. Because an increasingly unhealthy sterility that is spreading weakens the immune system of Earthlings and makes them more susceptible to bacteria, parasites, and viruses.
The more people on Earth live in a sterile way and create physically sterile conditions, the more frequently they fall ill as a result of immune deficiency than would be the case under normally dirty living and general conditions. Too much sterility as a result of excessive hygiene inevitably leads sooner or later to allergies, asthma, autoimmune diseases, etc. Two sterile living conditions correspond to a delusion of hygiene and disturb the development of the immune system even in childhood, which also leads to weakness in life and susceptibility to disease in later life. In this way, the number of autoimmune diseases also increases, because the fewer people come into contact with pathogens from the environment and the less they are able to build up and strengthen their immune system, the more susceptible they become to disease and unable to cope with it.
Even today, the majority of Earth humans erroneously have the wrong opinion that Earth's mankind consists of different races, which is not true in principle, because Earth humanity is in truth only one race, which consists, however, of many different peoples. Your father Shvath already explained that to me and shed some light on the facts. But now it would be good if we could talk about it openly. But I think that you could explain what is important.
I can do that, yes. The term race in relation to individuals is only related to their biological species or genus, whereby this corresponds to a rank within the hierarchy of biological systematics. The genus usually has subspecies and is therefore above each species but below the family. A genus can contain a single species or any number of species. If a genus contains only one species, this corresponds to a so-called monotypic genus. If several species have emerged from a genus, this corresponds to a group of species of common ancestry, which means that one species has emerged from another species, or that other species have emerged from other species. Thus, a clear morphological distance or separation is given. The species of one genus are more closely related to each other than to any other species of another genus. All species within a genus are always designated by a binary or two-part name, which consists of the genus name and the species epithet on the one hand. The genus name is always in the singular form, and the species epithet repeats the sex of the genus name. The term human being, as it corresponds to the terrestrial human being, describes its structure according to certain inner physical characteristics, namely the primarily phenomenologically ascertainable organic structure and state within the body. The inner physical organic structure and condition and their special typical characteristics alone correspond to race characteristics which show differences to other human forms of life. Just as with regard to alien human species which are located outside Earth's realm called exohumans. So the whole inner body organ complex and its structure, as well as the outer body structure, is race determining, but not the outer body characteristics with regard to eye, skin and hair color, etc. of the respective genus or species, as they appear in the different peoples on Earth, which are not own races, but belong only to the human race, which all around with their outer body characteristics belong to the one human race, like we Plejaren. The different peoples each have their own skin pigmentations, such as their own body sizes, eye and hair colors, as well as their own nose, head and body shapes, and also individual physiological factors such as heat regulation, sweat production, lactose intolerance, and certain blood characteristics, etc. come to bear. Psychological differences and other characteristics are also evident, many of which result mainly from adaptation to different climatic conditions and are relatively homogeneous and visible on the surface within each continent. For the layman, this makes the erroneous impression that the people of the peoples with their outward physical differences, and because they are on different continents and in other countries, are their own pure races, whereby this assumption is, however, fundamentally wrong, because on Earth only one human race originated and exists from the ground up, which is, however, divided into many different peoples with many different outward physical characteristics. Even the exo-migrants were human beings just as they emerged from Earth.
Modern genetic investigations, analyses and findings from the 20th century and also from today's 21st century prove this. The biological concept of human races is, as I once read in an article today, generally regarded as scientifically overcome and is replaced by the not biologically but geographically defined concept of population.
Right. Our own research also shows very clearly that the phenotypic structure of the terrestrial human being, respectively his appearance, genetically expresses the whole set of all characteristics of his organism in the same way. So the phenotype or appearance is the genetic set of all characteristics of the human organism, whereby the whole refers not only to morphological characteristics or to the form, external shape, and structure, but also to physiological or natural and psychological characteristics. The phenotype is determined by the interaction of hereditary factors, but also by environmental factors. However, the extent to which the phenotype can be influenced by environmental influences always depends on the reaction norm, whereby this possibility of reacting to environmental influences is effectively genetically determined.
Thank you for your comments. Then there is the question of what should actually be held by those people who believe that democracy prevails in their countries, although that is not the case. Apart from a truly given form of democracy, as is the case in Switzerland in the form of an effective semi-democracy, there is no form of democracy on earth in any state, especially not in the EU, which is a dictatorship, as your father Svath predicted, that this dictatorship union will come into being. In an effectively full democracy, the people alone have the say, and in a semi-democracy, such as the one that exists in Switzerland, the people have the majority or half of the right to determine. But only half and not all, because the other half of the right is assigned to the Federal Council, the National Council, and the Council of States. This is a good way for the citizens of Switzerland to live well, but as a result of only half the democracy, they cannot have a say in everything. Nevertheless, the Swiss Confederation, as a federal republic with its system of directorates, is a good country and, what is more, truly linked to semi-democracy, which practically cannot be said of any other state on earth, because there are no democratic traits to be found in it, and especially not in the EU dictatorship, which terrorizes all the states belonging to it, which do not defend themselves against it, and simply let everything happen to them with cowardice. But that cannot and will not remain as you once said, because the dictatorially harassed EU states and their peoples have been fermenting for some time now.
In principle, a country's population can only have a real right to determine where there is an effective democracy, by which it must be understood that it is a matter of the rule of the ordinary people, who determine absolutely alone, while the authorities elected by the people only take a consultative and proposing position and a position of carrying out the people's will. In this way, a form of democracy must be governed by a constitution that guarantees the entire population general personal and political rights, as well as the freedom of individual thought, conviction, and expression, the freedom of expression, speech, belief, and fair elections, independent courts, and valued judgments. Democracy also means that a state does not have an international or union law, but a national sovereignty that corresponds politically to normality, in the sense that only the people pass laws and determine everything politically, while the government is the only exercising and advising power. Without the consent of the people, it cannot be in a democracy that the authorities elected by the people, without the direct consent of the people, decide something against the people's will, so it cannot be the exercise of sanctions or the declaration of wars, etc., against other states. Even the dissolution or establishment of states or parts of states by governments must never happen economically and politically in a democracy, as happened to the contrary without the consent of the peoples in the dictatorial founding of the EU dictatorship. And since this was done by self-opinionated, criminal and domineering dictatorial elements, the result was a project that was inadequate in terms of civilization, from which an epoch of discord and dissatisfaction arose in all EU dictatorship member states, as well as an epoch of mad confrontation and readiness for war with Russia. A fact from which the mania of the male and female EU dictators results that now the power project monster EU dictatorship should acquire nuclear weapons and create an EU dictatorship army. And the EU dictatorship greedy for power, above all the German Chancellor Merkel, are striving to let the individual EU dictatorship member states and their rulers as well as the peoples go by as extras on the global stage. As an EU dictatorship, this catastrophic arbitrary entity is absolutely incapable and unwilling to solve any of its own problems, nor to speak with one voice internationally. That's all there is to it.
But there are clear words that you said. And what you say has its hands and feet. Also with regard to your statement that it is fermenting in the EU dictatorship, which may one day lead to its collapse, for which Great Britain made the start. But also in Holland and other EU dictatorship states, the fermentation is progressing, and the people as well as the governments are becoming more and more hostile to the dictatorship. That's what you used to say about the GDR, where criminal machinations against the population were part of the order of the day. And when I think only of the fact that in the GDR, 103 people were secretly sentenced to death and executed because they did not fit Erich Honecker and co-politically etc. into the stuff, but that this did not become public with the GDR population or in the world outside, then I could imagine that sooner or later also the EU dictatorship acts equally or will act in the future. The death penalty in the EU dictatorship was brought into force with the Treaty of Lisbon on 1st of December 2009.
The possibilities are indeed open.
I thought so. But something else that refers to you, Playarin. Because as you have explained to me, the majority of the population works only 2 hours or so per day according to our time, while the other time is used in a private way. You have told me that in your free time the Playarin work and maintain their large private gardens, which cover at least 1 hectare or 10,000 square meters. Others fly with their aircraft over land or around the planet and land where other people work to do private work together. And all this happens without any financial compensation because you have no financial economy anymore. But even if you are only about 530 million people on Era, there is quite a lot of work to be done to feed the whole population and to satisfy all their other needs. I will ask you how you manage this so that everything can be created when the majority of your humanity works only 2 hours a day for the general public. Is there no problem with that?
The whole thing would be impossible if we did not have our very sophisticated, extensive, and diverse technology at our disposal. Basically, of course, our planetary population also has to do a lot of work, which has to be carried out, but which is largely carried out by our highly developed technology. The main of all activities is carried out by elaborate androids, apparatuses, and machinery, which are monitored and controlled by the majority of the working population during the 2 hours of work. And these are effectively only surveillance and control works to be carried out by the majority of the Era population. According to times in day and night divisions, to which you once said around the clock in another context.
The majority of the population, what does that mean?
It must be understood to mean all persons at any age from 140 years of age, which is to be understood according to earthly years, and this is maintained until old age. Because every person in our society is involved throughout his or her life, either for the general public or in a purely private way. Our 530 million or so humanity is to be understood in terms of the people who carry out their work, which, however, do not include descendants up to 140 years of age, who also include a number of about 110 million.
You mean 110 million? So there is no rotting in any way of the physical and thought-feel-psychological, as is very often the case with us on Earth, after people retire and then know nothing more to do with themselves. But I didn't know that you wouldn't count the 110 million descendants, who are up to 140 years old, among the approximately 530 million of the working people. But I think that this has to be added up because your planet Era is about the same size as Earth, but has more mainland, as you once explained.
The old calculations for Earth are correct, which call about 529 million Earth population. Basically, it is not the size of the planet that is important for a certain number of human or human-like forms of life, but the land masses and their fertility factors. As a result, for example, Earth-sized planets, like Era is 1, can have smaller or larger land masses that are more or less fertile, as a result of which the population number and their food requirements can be calculated. We Pleiaren measure in this respect the possible population according to the fertile land that, when cultivated for food products, produces abundant food for the total population. As a result, no part of the population can ever be affected by famine, as is the case on Earth, where around 1 billion people are currently suffering from hunger, and many die from it. And as far as such behavior, which you call rotting, is concerned, Pleiaren is alien to us. Even if a person wants to withdraw from general work and only be active privately, which is of course possible, but must be guaranteed. However, this is usually only possible at the age of 800, although very little use is usually made of it.
Then it must also be the case that these people still have their entire livelihood when they retire from general work at the age of 800. How's that settled?
They are fully granted everything necessary in every respect and for every need until the end of their lives. So they do not have to renounce anything in any way, but receive everything according to their desires, be it food or any things of any kind that they desire.
So there are no people among you who are, as they say, poor or rich, if I understand your social system correctly, which is also due to the fact that you no longer have any means of payment or money.
This is indeed the case, because since we have no system whatsoever with regard to a monetary or financial economy, but an equal structure of equality, on the one hand with regard to social status and on the other with regard to the values of goods, there are no social and no social differences.
And this also not between the simple people, the spiritual leadership, and all those who have to carry out higher tasks than the normal daily general work.
There are no differences whatsoever. And there must be no differences because the equal status of the entire Era population means that neither greed nor envy nor other negative factors, which could be caused by material causes, prevail. Every Pleiarenian person has equal rights, including the right to meet all his material needs within the same framework as any other. Thus, all manufactured goods of any kind are available to any person free of charge, as are all other goods.
And the rest of the majority of the population, what about it in terms of work and old age? How many percentages does this rest comprise, and what does it do?
According to our calculations, the majority of the entire player population comprises 72%, which is active in the way I have just explained, while the other 28% is responsible for other tasks, in which, calculated according to earthly hours, the working hours vary per day depending on the activity, but which are higher than 2 hours and are often 12, 15, or more. This is the case, for example, with the exercise of tasks related to spiritual leadership, planetary control tasks, and various other important matters.
Planetary control tasks like those Injana and Florina have been performing on Earth for some years now?
Among other things, yes.
Well, then this. As we've talked about before, your father Svath taught me that human intelligence is dependent on various factors, including all that has been experienced and the experiences that have resulted from it. The perceptible influences of fellow human beings, as well as the fauna and flora and the environment as a whole, play very important roles. Especially the human cultural influences help to shape the intelligence, so that it is strongly influenced and shaped when the human being moves in and deals with different human cultures. To move in foreign cultures, for example by working in foreign countries and living and communicating together with the peoples there, contributes very substantially to the development of intelligence, whereby the overall intelligence of the human being cannot be measured and determined with an IQ system, as Earthlings always maintain. Furthermore, and especially in context, as Svath explained, the entire cultural and environmental influences are of enormous importance with regard to the ongoing development of intelligence. Consequently, Cultural development, which continues to progress in every country and people, also has a positive effect on the further development of intelligence. At least that's how I understood your father's explanations back in the 1940s.
Which is absolutely right, then nothing more can be explained. But now I have a question about these pages here on your desk where I read something before you came. What you write is very interesting, but what do you want with it?
Actually, I wanted to write something about the political and economic situation in the world under the title Humankind on Earth. Finally strive for peace and freedom instead of war and terror. But apparently the whole thing will be a bit longer. Maybe a little book.
Really very interesting.
It is probably necessary. I think that I too write something about it, because if I look at the human career and the whole resulting development, then I can only say that the development of mankind is written in blood. The fact is that the history of humanity on Earth is based on torture. Hatred, war, murder, revenge, terror, manslaughter, and retaliation, but also on religious sectarian delusion, lust for power, and greed for power. Since time immemorial, the overwhelming majority in all communities of humanity has been oriented towards the striving for power. The hunger for power, ambition, the delusion of power, the urge for power, the urge for prestige, the obsession with power, the claim to power, and the craving for glory. Many are also addicted to a profile neurosis, which expresses itself in the fear of being too little regarded by fellow human beings. Such people are driven by their pathological thinking of inferiority to express in an exaggerated way a power-exercisable behavior. On the other hand, there are also many people who make reasonable efforts for a long time to be good and to become even better. But then for some reason which they cannot control and cope with, it happens that they cannot cope with something and therefore stop being good and do not become better anymore. This, Svath once said, is because these people have a weakness in life reality, but also a lack of perception of reality, as well as a lack of self-confidence in the energy and power of positive self-activity.
There is no doubt that you are right about what you said, as well as about what my father explained to you.
The poison glyphosate is once again a widespread topic of conversation because it is irresponsibly declared harmless and harmless to humans. Perhaps it would be good if you would say something about it again, because that would certainly be important.
Against all denials of the manufacturer Monsanto, its expert judges and the governments and health authorities, which call the herbicide or total herbicide glyphosate as harmless and not harmful to human health, exactly the opposite is the case. As a result of your interest, we have been able to prove in large-scale research that glyphosate is life-threatening to humans and all fauna organisms even in the smallest amounts. In humans alone, cancer and many other diseases and ailments are caused by glyphosate. But all mammals and other life forms also suffer health damage in many ways, even from minimal amounts of glyphosate, which is extremely toxic. The diversity of plant species is also impaired by this and over time is even brought to extinction. In addition, even the slightest amount of glyphosate is deposited in the plants, which serve as food for humans and mammals, etc., when treated with the herbicide. Therefore, the smallest amounts of toxic glyphosate residues can be found in foods naturally produced for human consumption and also in industrially produced foods, as well as in forage plants and waters that serve as food and drinking water for wildlife and small organisms. Enrichments as toxic residues are also found in all kinds of feeding stuffs, in particular in products used in agriculture for feeding horses, cattle, pigs, and poultry. Toxic glyphosate residues, however, are also contained in food for life forms kept by terrestrial humans as household members, such as dogs, cats, birds, mice, rats, and hamsters, etc., due to the low glyphosate residues in the natural food plants. These are thus transported in various ways into the food of humans and all living beings, and consequently the food meat of slaughtered animals is also contaminated, which is consumed by humans. This in turn leads to malformations in newborns, miscarriages, kidney damage, and various types of cancer. According to our research, glyphosate damages the environment and health of humans, fauna, and flora in a way that is not even excessively characteristic of all other known herbicides. And when it rains, the glyphosate applied is flushed by the plants and paths, etc., sprayed with it into the next sewage ditches, into the sewage systems, into brooks, ponds, and rivers, but it also seeps away underground and poisons the groundwater because glyphosate is highly toxic to water. Depending on the dose, glyphosate in water destroys almost everything that lives and grows in it, whether fish, insects, newts, frogs, dragonfly larvae, algae, or aquatic plants, as well as many terrestrial organisms die from it, and at least become ill and sick when they drink the water contaminated with glyphosate. And what kills the fauna and flora also leaves its mark on humans, making them sick and suffering, following which they suffer from cancer, allergies, epidemics, and diseases due to glyphosate residues and die miserably. And in this way it goes on for years, in which glyphosate gradually creates cancer, diseases, sufferings, and epidemics. This also includes autism, which usually develops in the mother's womb in food contaminated by glyphosate and is then absorbed by the newborn through the mother's milk, which is also contaminated. But glyphosate does not only affect farmers, whom I have mentioned in relation to agriculture, because it also affects all gardeners and hobby gardeners, railway workers and chicory workers, etc., who deal directly with glyphosate and take in glyphosate residues via skin pores and possibly also via the mouth, which also settle in all basic foodstuffs. Glyphosate is thus found in barley, oats, rice, rye, and wheat, and via these also in many flour products, such as pasta and bakery products, but also in cereal flakes of all kinds, as well as in maize, soya, and sugar, etc. But vegetables and berries are also affected, as is drinking water. Because the toxic substances, as already mentioned, seep into the groundwater, and sooner or later this is used by humans for food preparation and also drunk by all imaginable creatures. And if glyphosate is ingested by humans through food and drink, even in small amounts, it will sooner or later have a toxic effect. Even on mothers with regard to mother's milk, which in one way or another damages the health of fetuses in the womb, as well as causing malformations and miscarriages. Also, respiratory problems and skin diseases are caused by glyphosate, as well as an increasing loss of biological diversity, such as the rapid death of bees. Glyphosate also triggers chronic botulism in cattle, a poisoning disease that can affect both humans and all mammals. Even in small amounts, glyphosate and other glyphosate-containing substances damage human embryonic and placenta cells as well as the DNA of humans. Amphibians, animals, reptiles, birds, fish, other aquatic organisms, and all kinds of other life forms. In the human body, glyphosate can lead to complete cell death within just 24 hours. Glyphosate also paves the way for Alzheimer's and diabetes and, as already mentioned, for cancer and all sorts of diseases and body diseases, as well as for depression, heart attacks, and infertility in both sexes. Glyphosate also has very high negative effects on soil fertility and overall soil organisms. Certain pathogenic parasitic molds are also promoted, such as fusarium fungi that kill their host. Micronutrients can no longer be absorbed by microorganisms and fungi, and plants can no longer defend themselves against disease, which means that earthworms, which are indispensable for the aeration of soils, die out or avoid soils contaminated with glyphosate. Glyphosate appears in the urine of humans, animals, and other living organisms of various species, even if they have not come into direct contact with glyphosate when spraying plants, soil, water, etc. There is a classical or acute botulism and a chronic or visceral botulism, whereby both forms are caused by toxins of the bacterium Clostridium botulinum, whereby especially the nerve toxin BON-T or neurotoxin is of enormous importance and the strongest toxin at all. In purely theoretical terms, a mere 40 grams would suffice to destroy the entire earthly human race. If the symptoms of botulism are considered in diseased cattle, then emaciation or a life-threatening emaciation, as well as a drop in performance such as in consumption or tuberculosis and cancer, are noticeable. Further symptoms are a duck run, also known as watchel run, as well as a pulled-up belly, staggering and limited reflexes, whereby also a disturbed drinking behavior and continuous salivation are typical, as well as abomasal dislocations and non-healing skin wounds, as well as rumen paralysis or paralysis of the largest of the three preomacs, which serves as a large fermentation chamber. Botulism bacteria primarily multiply in meat and plants when they fall into decay. If cattle ingest such bacteria through food that is interspersed with the neurotoxin BON-T, a case of classical botulism arises. Chronic botulism is initially caused solely by the spores of the botulism bacteria when they are ingested with food and only begin to act and germinate in the intestinal tract. Cattle suffering from chronic botulism due to chronic glyphosate poisoning become permanent excretors of spores of botulism bacteria. This also creates an increased and permanent risk of infection for uninfected animals, which can also infect farmers, other people, and other living creatures. In humans, an infection can lead to eyelid heaviness, muscle weakness, difficulty swallowing, such as a dip in the throat, and a frequent urge to urinate with a persistent feeling of residual urine. Glyphosate kills all health-promoting bacteria in the stomach and intestines of humans, cattle, and all forms of life, thus causing severe damage to the intestinal flora, which means that bacteria of all kinds, especially the botulism bacterium, can no longer be sufficiently repelled.
However, the policy does not do anything about it, and consequently the prospects for an effective hazard classification with regard to glyphosate and thus a corresponding ban on the dangerous active substance are not considered at all. It is disillusioning that Monsanto and the majority of health researchers, politicians, and governments have known for about 20 years that glyphosate contains life-threatening substances for all living beings. However, this is irresponsibly trivialized or fundamentally denied, and many people continue to die of cancer and other diseases and ailments, as well as many birth defects caused by glyphosate. On the whole, there has been little or no political action so far to ban glyphosate as a matter of principle, so that it can only be assumed whether it will ever be banned at all. The fact is that many of the politicians and commissioners are high-ranking employees who have to decide on such things, and they stand for genetically modified feed and food closely linked to the agro-industry, who are paid horrendously for their support for the production and sale of glyphosate and so on. If one looks at these politicians, commissioners, and high-ranking employees who vote for glyphosate and other toxic pesticides and their residues, it is clear that some of these proponents are or have been closely associated with, among others, toxin producers, such as the large corporations BASF, Bayer, Monsanto, and Syngenta, etc. And these are corporations that are massively opposed to a ban on certain pesticides and that all have products containing glyphosate in their product ranges. If one considers that Monsanto alone with its glyphosate-containing product Roundup has a turnover of $2 billion, then it should be absolutely clear that all other agrochemical companies and their representatives are also earning large fortunes and are therefore already trying to prevent a ban on this active ingredient. Your findings alone make it absolutely clear that glyphosate, the plant destroyer, is highly hostile to life and even deadly to humans, fauna, and flora, and thus to the whole world. However, the fact that so far, from a political point of view, not enough has been done to ban glyphosate in its production, sale, and use can effectively be seen as political failure. It is simply incomprehensible that, despite all negative signs, Glyphosate-containing products may continue to be produced, sold and distributed on a massive scale, although an immediate halt to production, sale, and use must be the only correct measure that can be considered.
The fact is that our research clearly proves that glyphosate causes health and other damage and even death to humans, fauna, and flora.
The interests of agriculture and large-scale horticulture should no longer be given economic precedence, but immediate action should be taken wherever glyphosate has long caused serious damage to fauna and flora and is still causing increasing damage, especially to human health. An immediate halt to the production, sale, and use of glyphosate is of the utmost urgency, as treated food and feed causes death, extinction of fauna and flora, and spoilage. Last but not least, the entire political system must also be called into question, which does not assume its responsibility and allows Monsanto and the poison economy as a whole to exert pressure on farmers and nurseries to achieve ever higher yields, as do Monsanto and other poison corporations, ever more horrendous profits, regardless of people, nature, its fauna and flora, water, and the entire environment.
That is also according to my sense.
Recently, someone said that I was an agnostic or atheist, but I contradicted him because I am anything but a man who does not know whether there is a God creator in a religious or sectarian sense. For an agnostic is not sure in this respect and therefore does not commit himself to it, and leaves the existence or non-existence of a creator God unanswered. Although an atheist does not believe in a God or God creator, he is one-sided in the way that he is caught up in the belief that all existence, including his own, is only once and then no longer, probably because he is absolutely ignorant of his spiritual form and all spiritual concerns and does not even concern himself with them. Agnosticism means not to know in ancient Greek, and in this manner of not knowing, the agnostic assumes that the existence or even the non-existence of a god or its several gods cannot be proven, as is the case with supernatural beings such as angels or spirits. If an agnostic is asked whether there is a God or not, he inevitably answers, "I don't know." This distinguishes him from the atheist who is absolutely convinced of a world and a universe without God or gods. This in contrast to a believer who explains everything only by and with the existence of one or more gods. The agnostic regards both attitudes as presumptuous because he considers human knowledge to be absolutely limited on this point. According to his understanding, there are many arguments for and also against all religious and sectarian worldviews, whereby he basically cannot decide for one side or the other. So, an agnostic is a person who is actually religious or sectarian in some strange way. That is, he believes in a God, and at the same time accepts that he may not even exist. In this way, he also practices religious customs, although he knows or believes that these may be ineffective. As a rule, however, agnostics claim that God's proofs and miraculous experiences are unreal, as are ideas about the creation of the world, heaven, hell, and rebirth. Even a life after death does not stand up to scrutiny by modern natural science, from which it follows for the agnostic that he shapes his everyday life without his religious practice, without or with a God. Well, the doubts which men who are gifted with understanding and reason and thus also think logically and realistically about the existence of one or more gods are already very old, although the belief in one God or in gods has been much stronger and more widespread among the whole of mankind since the earliest times because of people who are not gifted with reality and reason and who have impaired understanding and reason. And in fact, there is no evidence whatsoever for a God, neither in nature, its fauna and flora, nor in the entire universe, nor in the mind and reason of man, but there are very many, even countless, opposites. But this is not surprising, because in earlier times the Earth humans had to be forced believers in religion and thus believers in God, because in the past centuries a criticism of religion was socially very problematic, sometimes even life-threatening, because whoever expressed himself as religiously unbelieving had to reckon with being branded a witch or witch, tortured and burned at the stake, drowned in water, beheaded or hanged, etc. When in the 18th and 19th centuries these persecutions slowly came to an end, at least for the most part, the time of the Enlightenment and the gradual separation of state. Society and religion prevailed just as slowly, which increasingly paved the way for the ideas of the agnostics. Especially philosophers of that time devoted themselves to agnosticism, such as David Hume, 1711, 1776, Immanuel Kant, 1724, 1804, and Soren Kierkegaard, 1813, 1855. But as far as the atheists are concerned, I would like to briefly say that atheism, which in ancient Greek means atheos, =without God, is based on the absence or rejection of faith in a god or in God's theism. Atheism in the broader sense also includes some views of agnosticism or agnostic atheism. Accordingly, the existence of God or gods is unclear or simply not explainable. In the narrower sense, however, it denotes the testimony that there is no God or gods. In the sense of religious or sectarian believer, atheism or an atheist, as well as an agnostic, is called pagan, denier of God, godless, non-Christian, unbaptized and religiously unbeliever, etc. But when I now have to describe my own thought direction and my knowledge behavior, then I formulate it as free thinking, free reflection and free thinking. Namely because my consciousness is as free, wide, and reality as my spirit, which animates it, and because it is also as free and wide as my thoughts and feelings, the world, nature, and the universe.
You know how to explain things.
Thank you, but there are people who do not share the same view and think that I am a fool, as you know. But for that I just think they are arrogant and want to cover their own foolishness with it.
If someone calls you a fool, it does not make you one. The degree of folly would depend only on the weight of false evidence and false explanations that would speak against your statements. But there is always sufficient weight of evidence and explanation that those who accuse you of folly are, to the contrary, themselves addicted to folly, to a profound degree.
Then I would like to discuss some things with you now that...
Of course, but after that I have to go my way.
Good, of course. Then the following,